A former top Ukrainian military official says Ukrainian President Zelensky needs to know the situation on the front lines is a, quote, complete mess. CNN's Nick Payton-Walsh speaks to people near those front lines in eastern Ukraine who hope that their homes and towns will remain Ukrainian.
Forget a moment about Alaska and imagine being here, where Russia is advancing, where its drones could not reach when we were there a week ago, despite the endless talk of a peace deal. It's exactly here that land might be swapped.
There'll be some land swapping going on.
His special envoy's visit to the Kremlin leading to reports Ukraine might just give away Donetsk and sparking panic among real people here yesterday at a Donetsk railway station and, frankly, all over Ukraine. Speaking to European officials over the past days, one of the challenges seems to have been for them trying to clarify exactly what it was that US envoy Steve Witkoff was offered by the Kremlin. What are the bones and details of that potential deal? And that just adds to how unconventional this whole process feels. A meeting of this grandeur would take months normally to prepare, with the agenda and details ironed out by teams of diplomats for months. Instead, at this point, so much is still unknown.
This is really a feel-out meeting, a little bit.
President Trump has lowered expectations for their first meeting in 6 years, while Russia keeps flaunting claims it's captured towns like this.
Він точно не готується до припинення вогню і війни.
President Zelensky clear, as the evidence supports so far, Putin does not seek peace.
Так, як і раніше. Немає жодної ознаки, що росіяни отримали сигнали готуватись до післявоєнної ситуації. Навпаки, вони переміщують свої війська та сили таким чином, щоб розпочати нові наступальні операції.
On the eastern front line, near this town, Dobropilya, reports Tuesday emerged of a notable Russian advance. The extent or permanence unclear, but enough to spark denials and reinforcements from Kiev. Wednesday, Zelensky will join German Chancellor Friedrich Merz and other key European leaders and, this time, President Trump to pre-game Alaska, clarifying, if the White House hasn't heard it yet, that Europe wants a ceasefire first and Ukraine at the table. But what awaits in Alaska? Likely only Putin and Trump. And from that, a roll of the dice between two men whose relationship is impenetrable but could decide the fate of tens of millions of lives in Ukraine and beyond. Now, Jake, just a reminder that days ago we were looking at the potential for secondary sanctions against Russia's main energy customers, India and China, and then talk of that seemed to evaporate. And now focus turned to this summit in Alaska on Friday that was meant to really be make or break about a peace deal, but has now had expectations lowered so extensively that the White House referred to it as a listening exercise, that President Trump says he's going to feel Russian President Vladimir Putin out a bit as to what's possible. A lot changing fast as to what people think may be viable in this key summit. Ukrainians deeply anxious. So they're not only not there, the potential for peace is much less. Jake?
All right, Nick Payton-Walsh in Kyiv, Ukraine for us. Thank you so much. Joining us now to discuss Republican Congressman Don Bacon from Nebraska. Thanks for joining us, Congressman. So you told Canadian channel CBC that President Trump has been, quote, unpredictable and hit and miss on Russia. What topics or concessions would you advise President Trump to stay away from on Friday?
He should not be offering land for peace, Ukrainian land, and he should have President Zelensky at the table. You know, it's too reminiscent of 1938 when the Prime Minister of Great Britain and the leader of France met with Hitler and, you know, gave away Sudetenland of Czechoslovakia and came back so they had peace in our time. We don't want that. Any negotiation has to have Zelensky at the table, and we have to force Putin to agree to that. He doesn't want to have Zelensky at the table. He doesn't want people to see Ukraine as an equal to Russia, or Zelensky is an equal leader to Putin. And so that vision or that image is something he does not want. But we can't be giving concessions to Russia and rewarding an invasion, bombing cities, commit all these war crimes that Putin has done. And so I hope we see a Trump that we've seen in the last month, not the President Trump that we've seen the first 7 or 8 months of his presidency, where I thought he was way too weak on Putin And so we want to see a stronger Trump standing up for freedom and standing on the right side of this war.
President Zelensky reiterated today that he is not willing to cede any land in eastern Ukraine because it would give Putin a springboard to invade other parts of his country. Do you agree with Zelensky, or do you think ultimately he will need to cede some land in order for there to be any sort of peace deal?
Well, he clearly shouldn't cede any land that hasn't been taken by Russia. And that's been floated out there, that the whole Donbass or the whole, those 2 or 3 provinces that would totally be ceded over, not just the areas that Russia controls. I think that would be a terrible mistake. In the end, I have to defer to the Ukrainians on what land, if any, that they cede. But I do think this: if any land is ceded to Russia, we must provide security guarantees to Ukraine, whether it's NATO or bilateral security guarantees, because I believe it's 95% certain that if we just do a truce, next year Putin will break it again and start the invasion all over again. And so whatever agreement is done, if Ukraine has to cede anything, security guarantees are very important to prevent Putin from doing this invasion again.
Former presidential envoy Brett McGurk says that President Trump should take a cue from President Reagan. When Reagan met with Russian President Mikhail Gorbachev in Iceland in 1986, he writes, Reagan, quote, arrived with firm principles on which he would not budge. Reagan's refusal to budge, even at risk of increasing Cold War tensions, and the failed summit 1 month before midterm elections ultimately set the conditions for peace. Do you think Trump will be able to be that stern with Putin too, or do you think maybe his desire to strike a deal, to be seen as this great deal maker, might overtake the actual quality of the deal?
He needs to be strong like Reagan, like we saw at Reykjavik, where Reagan walked away when he saw that Gorbachev was making demands that went against his principles. So we need Trump to have that same mindset. And that is a weakness with Americans in general. I mean, I study history. We want to get a deal. We want to get a deal fast. Because of that, our opponents know that, and we make unnecessary concessions and put ourselves in a bad spot. And a case in point, before President Trump's even met with Putin, he's talking about Ukraine having to do land swaps before he's even talked to Putin. And I think doing any kind of concessions before you even meet with Putin, that's a bad thing. And that's not just a President Trump thing. We see that on our side quite a bit. We're too eager to get a deal, and that puts us at a disadvantage.
I wanted to get your response to something that Vice President Vance said over the weekend. Take a listen.
I think the president, and I certainly think that America, we're done with the funding of the Ukraine war business. We want to bring about a peaceful settlement to this thing. We want to stop the killing. But Americans, I think, are sick of continuing to send their money, their tax dollars to this particular conflict.
What did you make of that?
I think he's wrong. First of all, I take offense when he says we're tired of sending money to the Ukrainian war business, or something like that. This is not the Ukrainian war business. This is the Russian invading Ukraine, an innocent, sovereign country. That's the war we're in. This isn't Ukraine's war. This is Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And he seems to not have the moral clarity to see that, and it bothers me. And by the way, 2 out of 3 Americans support Ukraine. These guys are taking a political stand that most Americans disagree with. I wish our leadership in the White House stood tall on principle. We're the land of the free. We're the defenders of freedom. America is that bright light on the hill, and we should act that way. Trying to treat Ukraine and Russia as equals when one country is actually invading the other, that's a failure. So I'd like to see moral clarity out of our vice president on this. And I think he's standing with 1/3 of Americans, not the 2/3 in this. And if he spoke up more clearly, it would be more than 2 out of 3. Maybe we'd see 3 out of 4 standing here. So we need President Vance's or Vice President Vance's leadership here, not moral weakness.